Scott is, and before I get any further, those of you who went on our various interpretive programs in this past few days, they were spectacular, and I bet most of you agree. Scott basically is the brainchild behind all of that fabulous interpretive programming that we have enjoyed for the past many days, and so thank you, Scott. Scott's topic today is Despair, Defeat, Redemption, and Determination, the Army of the Potomac, 1863. Scott is a 33, almost 34-year-long veteran of the National Park Service, all here at Gettysburg National Military Park. He's the park's supervisory historian and has been so for the past 19 years. He won the Regional Freeman Tilden Award for Excellence in Interpretation in 1993 and has been fundamental in the growth of Gettysburg's on-site interpretation and living history programming, distance and satellite education efforts, and a key player in the design of Gettysburg National Military Park's world-class museum and visitor center. He has appeared on the History Channel, the Discovery Channel, the Pennsylvania Cable Network, and many, many other mediums, national and international. He is the author of numerous articles, essays, and books on the Civil War, subjects including the Antietam Creek and the Maryland Campaign of September 1862 just out. So if you will please with me, welcome Mr. Scott Hartwig.
Bob made me feel really old when he said 33, almost 34 years. I thought, wow, I've been here that long. Wanted to come up here kind of creaking up to, anyway, I don't feel like it. Hey, I appear kind of casual up here, and that's because last year, I think it was about 130 degrees in the tent. It was kind of like being in Baghdad, the type of heat you have. And last year I wore long slacks and all that sort of stuff and almost keeled over. So this year I decided I'd dress like you and just fit in with you. 1863 was a year of despair, defeat, redemption, and determination for the Army of the Potomac. It was a crucial year in the history of our country. That army, upon that army and the other armies in the Western Theater, rested the future of our form of government, of freedom, of emancipation, of union, of all these things. They rested upon this army. And it did not begin well. It began, as Major Rufus Dawes of the 6th Wisconsin would say, as a winter which was indeed for the Army the Valley Forge of the war. The Army was in despair. It was a huge army. It was the biggest it was ever going to be. As you can see, as you look up at the monitors, the Army numbered 155,000 officers and men present for duty on December 31st, 1862. Now, if you look at this order of battle, it doesn't look anything like it did during the Gettysburg campaign. For one, you have these things called grand divisions. They disappeared by the time of Gettysburg. You see names like Edwin Sumner, Darius Couch, Orlando Wilcox, George Stoneman, William Averill, William Smith, Franz Sigel. All names, if you're familiar with Gettysburg, that seem foreign. These are all a part of the Army, which is commanded by Major General Ambrose Burnside. Now, Burnside begins the year with a bang. He visits President Lincoln on January 1st, and after he returns to headquarters, which is at Falmouth, Virginia, which is right across the river from Fredericksburg, across the Rappahannock River, he sends President Lincoln this following note. Since leaving you this morning, I have determined that it is my duty to place on paper the remarks which I made to you, in order that you may use them or not as you see proper. I am in command, as you know, of nearly 200,000 men, 120,000 of whom are in the immediate presence of the enemy. And I cannot conscientiously retain the command without making an unreserved statement of my views. The Secretary of War has not the confidence of the officers and soldiers, and I feel that he has not the confidence of the country. The same opinion applies with equal force in regard to General Halleck. This is Henry Halleck, the Army Chief of Staff. I have attempted a movement upon the enemy in which I have been repulsed, the Battle of Fredericksburg. And I am convinced, after mature deliberation, that the Army ought to make another movement in the same direction, not necessarily at the same point on the river, but I am not sustained in this by a single Grand Division commander in my command. Think about being President Lincoln. Now, he's just told you that for him to retain command, you really need to get rid of the Secretary of War and the General-in-Chief of the armies. And also, he has a new plan, but not a single one of his senior commanders supports it. We have a problem. Now, General Marcina Patrick, who you see here in the middle, is the Provost Marshal of the Army of the Potomac at this time period. That means he's the commander of the military police of the Army. And if anybody knows the mood of the Army, it is Patrick, because he has to enforce the law. So he deals with all the lawbreakers, and he knows what the mood is. Fortunately for us, he kept a diary. On January 11th, he says, should our troops be paid off before the next action, I predict very large desertions and no possibility of staying them. There is a probability, I think, that Burnside will not long remain in command. The contest is between Franklin and Hooker for succession. On January 17th, the Provost Marshal for Sickles Division has been here to say the Excelsiors, that's the New York Brigade from New York City, are determined to run if they can get a chance, having been paid off today. I believe the men are unwilling again to fight at this point if they can get clear of doing so. There is a bad state of things all around. Hooker says he can have command of this army when he will say the word. He asks but 5 days to whip Lee, and 15 is all he will ask to take Richmond. He must be drunk. January 23rd, the order was given today for the men, the troops, to fall back again to their positions, occupied before the move on Monday. They have been passing all the day, and their appearance is not very soldier-like or encouraging. It is said that a very bad feeling has sprung up in the Army against Burnside, growing out of his Fredericksburg failure. And this last sad attempt, we're going to talk about that. It is the Mud March, is what they called it, which is perhaps more disastrous to him than the first. We are all disgusted. Not helping matters was the intrigue that gripped the Army's high command, which was leading to demoralization amongst some of the troops, and particularly amongst many of the officers. One of the greatest intriguers is the man you see to the left, commander of one of the Grand Divisions, Major General William B. Franklin. He did not like Burnside. He wanted to get rid of Burnside, and he aspired to command of the Army, along with another tremendous intriguer, Joseph Hooker. Colonel Charles Wainwright, who commanded the Artillery Brigade in the First Corps, talks about going over to Franklin's headquarters on January 19th. I went over to Franklin headquarters today. Both his staff and Smith's, General Smith commanded the 6th Army Corps in Franklin's Grand Division. Both of their staffs are talking outrageously, only repeating, though, no doubt, the words of their generals. Burnside may be unfit to command this army. His present plan may be absurd and failure certain, but his lieutenants have no right to say so to their subordinates. As it is, Franklin has talked so much and so loudly to this effect ever since the present move was decided on that he has completely demoralized his whole command and so rendered failure doubly sure. His conduct has been such that he certainly deserves to be broken. Henry Raymond was the editor of the New York Times. You see him down there in the lower right. He visited the Army during this time, and he writes, around the same time as Wainwright, a good deal has been said of the demoralization of the Army. The word is too strong. It does not apply to the mass of the Army at all, but it does apply to a good many of the officers who are demoralized in every sense of the word, and they are the source of discouragement to the ranks. They had committed themselves openly and publicly to the opinion that it would fail, the movement of Burnside, which started on January 19th, known as the Mud March. Perhaps it would be unreasonable to expect that they should work with any excess of vigor to secure the failure of their own predictions. In other words, why should they work for success? They didn't believe it would happen. They believed it would fail. And so they helped make it possible that everything would fail. January 19th to the 23rd is what the Army would later refer to as the Mud March. Burnside attempted this movement that all of his Grand Division commanders were opposed to. He tried to move up the Rappahannock. He was going to cross the river and hopefully outflank Lee. Now, a winter campaign was almost never undertaken in the Civil War for the reason of what happened to this. A nor'easter came up. Burnside, he was a guy you would never take to Las Vegas. No question. The man did not have luck. So January 19th, the storm starts to kick up, and then it just rained torrentially, and it was a disaster. Ultimately, Burnside had to order everybody back to their camps. Captain Francis Donaldson of the 118th Pennsylvania, in a letter to a friend at home, says, "Why, oh why, don't they remove this comically incompetent general? And if not McClellan, give us an officer we can have confidence in." Well, here we are back again at our old camp after the most wretchedly conducted campaign recorded in history. My mind is so shocked, my military pride so humbled, that I care not to record the events of the past few days. I speak not only for myself, but I voice the feeling of the whole Army when I say, as I have done before, that Burnside is an utter failure. The men ridicule and laugh at and have not respect at all for him. Whoops. The Army had a litany of complaints towards Burnside and just the Army in general. There was poor food. They weren't getting paid. The payroll system was a mess. No furloughs. You weren't going home. Guys were getting sick. There was a lot of sickness in the camps. There was no confidence in the leadership. Henry Abbott, the fellow you see pictured there, who left a number of very perceptive letters before he was killed in the Battle of the Wilderness in 1864, writes on January 3rd, criticizing Burnside's logistical ability. Burnside is a great man to be here 6 weeks, and yet, though closer to his base than we have ever been before, he hasn't completed arrangements enough to give the men their full rations and to feed the officers decently. McClellan would have had 2 lines of railroads and his whole army in tip-top condition in half the time. Whereas now, within a few hours of Washington, men are dying of scurvy because they haven't transportation enough to give us potatoes and onions. 19 days later, hasn't gotten any better. The state of the Army is terrible. They will live along quietly as long as you let them alone. But the minute Burnside gave the orders for moving, the explosion took place. The 15th Massachusetts and the Tammany, the 42nd New York, hooted the address on parade. And the former hooted Burnside as he rode past yesterday, hollering in the loudest voices, "Put him out! Put him out!" Such was the state of the Army of the Potomac at the end of January 1863. This is an army teetering on the state of utter demoralization. The Army was also dealing with the issue of emancipation. We know that Lincoln issued his preliminary emancipation in September of 1862. Emancipation became official policy of the federal government on January 1st. Now, the attitudes within the Army, I've read a lot of different things that people have said the soldiers felt. All the soldiers felt this. And, they'll pick a bunch of soldiers who hated the Emancipation Proclamation, or some people will pick soldiers who loved it and say this is how the whole Army felt. Well, just look at a few of these quotes, and you'll get an idea that the attitudes of the Army were all over the map. Henry Roos of the 31st New Jersey had no tolerance for emancipation whatsoever. His feeling was he knew the emancipation policy called for the recruitment of black troops. He didn't want any. In fact, he said there was going to be trouble if any of them came into the army. We consider this a white man's country, and that there are just enough of those who feel an interest in its perpetuity to put down the rebellion, but who will not be trifled with. Colonel Edward Cross, many of you know of him from the wheat field at Gettysburg, one of the great combat soldiers of the Army. He too didn't have much tolerance for this whole emancipation policy. The Army is full of abolition spies, he said, under the guise of tract distributors, state agents, chaplains, and sanitary commission agents. The correspondents of the abolition papers are also among the most malignant spies of the administration. Every opinion an officer privately expresses in social conversation is liable to appear against him when he least expects it. All the second and third-rate officers, the sneaks, the malingerers, the cowards have found this out and cover their deficiencies by the cloak of abolitionism. There's one interesting thing about Henry Roos and Colonel Edward Cross. They stayed with the Army. So what it tells you about men like this, who at this point in their lives didn't believe in emancipation or abolition, is that they believed in the preservation of the Union. They stayed with the Army. And if emancipation brought them closer to preserving the Union and winning the war, then they would tolerate it. But there were others in the Army who fully embraced it. And one of them was Major Rufus Dawes. He went home on leave that winter to Marietta, Ohio, and he was asked to give a speech at the town hall about the war. And he talks about emancipation and slavery. The Negroes will run away if they get a chance, whenever they are assured of their freedom, and that the proclamation places it beyond the power of any military commander, however disposed to prevent. Slavery is the chief source of wealth in the South and the basis of their aristocracy. And my observation is that a blow at slavery hurts more than a battalion's volleys. It strikes all the vitals. It is foolish to talk about embittering the rebels any more than they are already embittered. We like the proclamation because it hurts the rebels. We like the proclamation because it lets the world know what the real issue is. Well, Burnside had had enough. He was going to take action, and on January 23rd, he did. I call this the Great Sacking. General Orders Number 8, January 23rd. I'm not going to read the whole thing. General Joseph Hooker, Number 1, is hereby dismissed the service of the United States as a man unfit to hold an important commission. General W.T.H. Brooks, commanding 1st Division, 6th Army Corps, is dismissed from the military service of the United States. Brigadier General John Newton, commanding a division of the 6th Army Corps, is dismissed from the military service of the United States. It being evident that the following named officers can be of no further service to this Army, they are hereby relieved of duty. Wing Commander General Franklin, Grand Division Commander W.F. Smith, commanding the 6th Corps, Samuel Sturgis, commanding a division of the 9th Corps, General Edward Ferraro, and on and on. Fortunately, someone at headquarters saw this before Burnside issued it and said, the president really probably ought to see this first. President Lincoln advised General Burnside he could not issue that order, and it was never issued. 2 days later, the Army had a new commander. Burnside could no longer stay with the Army. He had to resign. And on January 25th, Fighting Joe Hooker, General Joseph Hooker, now took command of the Army of the Potomac. It was a post he'd aspired to for quite some time and felt very confident that he could handle this Army. Now, the Army, as it sized up its new commander, had a variety of opinions. Captain Henry Abbott said, "We all expect Hooker will soon make his grand failure and patiently wait for it." Colonel Charles Wainwright, who knew Hooker very well. The appointment of Fighting Joe Hooker to command of the Army of the Potomac has given great satisfaction and raised great expectations in the civilian world. The papers are loud in his praise. I cannot say that my own expectations are so high. Hooker may have learned a great deal since I left him, but judging from what I saw, I do not think him very much of a general in the higher branches of that position. His bravery is unquestioned, but he has not so far shown himself anything of a tactician. But Hooker took command of the Army with vigor, and he began to institute a number of reforms immediately. He abolished the grand divisions. We're just going to have Army Corps. He creates a cavalry corps. He concentrates the cavalry for the first time in the war. He improves camp sanitation. Sickness begins to decline. He also improved the quality of the food. He institutes a system of furloughs. The soldiers had a chance to go home. It was tremendously popular. It really put a dent in the desertions the Army was having. He makes sure that the soldiers are also getting fresh bread and vegetables. That helps combat scurvy. They start to get paid regularly so that they can go to the sutler and buy extra things. He really begins to improve morale. And one of the big morale builders that he has that we all are familiar with at Gettysburg, because you see them on all the monuments, are the Corps badges. This is the diamonds, the trefoils, the Maltese crosses, the Greek crosses that you see all over the battlefield. This was the patch that the soldiers were supposed to wear on top of their hat. The symbol would either be red, white, or blue. Red for 1st Division, white for the 2nd, blue for the 3rd Division. It enabled officers to easily identify what organizations a soldier belonged to, but it was tremendously popular amongst the soldiers. So by April 3rd of 1863, Hooker has reorganized this army, and it is very powerful, 138,378 men. Some of the names we see there, we recognize: Reynolds, Sickles, Meade, Sedgwick, Howard, Slocum. Stoneman and Couch are not going to be here at Gettysburg. The good and the bad. It's the strongest cavalry force ever assembled in the Eastern Theater. There's general regularity in the organization of the Army Corps, which is generally about 3 divisions per corps. The bad. Henry Hunt, the chief of artillery, a brilliant artillerist. Hooker doesn't really like Hunt. He could be kind of an annoying guy. He was a real anal sort of person about his branch of service. So he relegates Hunt only to a staff position. He's an advisor only. He has no tactical authority. And the artillery is very poorly organized. Except for 12 reserve batteries, all the other artillery is attached to infantry divisions, and our artillerymen will always tell you infantry do not know how to handle artillery. So a new campaign was about to begin. Now, you may remember Captain Francis Donaldson, how demoralized he was in January. Now, on the eve of a new campaign, he writes, "There is no finer disciplined army on this or any other continent than the Army of the Potomac." And no one has more confidence than Joe Hooker. "My plans are perfect. When I start to carry them out, may God have mercy on General Lee, for I will have none." It didn't work out as Hooker had hoped. It ended at Chancellorsville, 17,000 casualties, the bloodiest battle the Army of the Potomac had ever fought yet to date. As Ambrose Hayward tells us, who ever read of such a terrible battle as we have endured on that Saturday night? The men's faces still bear the mark of terror. By May 5th, the Army of the Potomac, which was double the size of the Army of Northern Virginia, had been defeated and retreated across the Potomac, or across the Rappahannock River to the North Bank. Immediately, recriminations and a search for scapegoats began to spread throughout the Army. Captain Donaldson, "I feel confident the historian will vindicate this Army and lay the blame where it belongs, upon General Hooker. Certainly the men blame him, and as a commander, he is of no further use to the cause and should be relieved before he can do more mischief. He can never fight this army successfully." George Meade, "General Hooker has disappointed all of his friends by failing to show his fighting qualities at the pinch. He was more cautious and took to digging quicker ever than McClellan, thus proving that a man may talk very big when he has no responsibility, but that it is quite a different thing acting when you are responsible, and talking when others are. G.K. Warren thought the problem was not Hooker. Our great weakness, in my opinion, is in the incompetency of many of our corps commanders. They don't know how to manage and fight troops. And Patrick Guiney, commanding the 9th Massachusetts, said it wasn't Hooker or the corps commanders. It was the blasted 11th Corps. We certainly would have gained a great victory were it not for the cowardice of the 11th Corps. The Dutch Corps ran. The rest of the Army fought well. Hooker deserved success and was beaten by two things: want of numbers, that's funny when you think about it, and the disgraceful flight of the Flying Dutchman. Well, the generals began to intrigue against one another again. We had Hooker versus Howard. We had Couch versus Hooker. Hooker versus Sedgwick, who he felt Sedgwick had failed. George Meade would write on May 10th, there's a great deal of talking in the camp, and I see the press is beginning to attack Hooker. I think these last operations have shaken the confidence of the Army in Hooker's judgment, particularly among the senior officers. 3 of my seniors, Couch, Slocum, and Sedgwick, have sent me word that they are willing to serve under me. Couch, I hear, told the president he would not serve any longer under Hooker and recommended my assignment to the command. I mentioned all this confidentially. How did this Army get through this year? It is remarkable that they did. This type of intrigue amongst their commanders. Now they had a new problem they had to deal with. One of the reasons Hooker wanted to fight the battle at the end of April, beginning of May, is enlistments were going to expire for many of his 9-month volunteers and 2-year volunteers. So in May, after the Battle of Chancellorsville, 23,000 men are going to leave the Army. That's 20% of the Army's effective numbers. If you add in the 17,000 casualties at Chancellorsville, the Army in May lost 32% of its strength. One of the reasons also why Robert E. Lee was emboldened to embark upon an offensive campaign. That campaign is going to be one of the most taxing the Army will ever endure. As Rufus Dawes, now a lieutenant colonel, will write on June the 6th, something important is impending. Both the armies are moving. The campaign would prove to be unbelievably arduous for the soldiers. Dawes would write, our marches have been long and tiresome. What do you think of trudging along all day in soaking rain, getting just as wet as a drowned rat, taking supper on hardtack and salt pork, and wrapping up in a wet woolen blanket in a wedge tent that only makes the rain more tantalizing, but turns it to a fine soaking mist, being waked up 3 or 4 times to attend to orders, and turning out finally at 3 in the morning to get the command ready to move? Well, that is soldiering. Sergeant Charles Bowen records in his diary the march. June 15th, the heat was intense all day, and the dust in such clouds that we could scarcely draw breath. I know of 7 men that fell dead, and a great part of the men were unable to keep up with their companies. Imagine if some of you were out there on July 2nd, July 3rd, July 4th, yesterday, and marching in that with all your equipment and your clothing. And you can imagine why he's talking about soldiers keeling over and dying during this march. I believe this to be the campaign of the war, and the Rebs have staked their all upon it, said Captain David Atchison. So the soldiers sense, June 28th, he writes this, that a major battle, a battle that might decide the fate of the war, is impending. This is an army that has gone through Fredericksburg, the despair of that winter, the defeat at Chancellorsville, the lack of leadership. The question is, will they fight? Well, the cavalry proves it will. At all these battles, those numbers are their casualties. William H. Redmond would write something from the 8th Illinois that was rarely written by a federal cavalryman before this. We drove the Rebs 8 miles. It was the prettiest fight I ever saw. And David Morgan also wrote something that no one would ever have thought of before. All the fighting since the Battle of Chancellorsville has been done by cavalry. And if they keep this up much longer, that branch will be almost extinct. Well, June 28th, the Army, as we know, is going to change commanders. Hooker, squabbling with the War Department, submits his resignation, and to his surprise, it is accepted. And Meade is placed in command. I was prepared for his bad news. That's because the staff officer who told Meade he was in command, the first thing he said to him was, "I'm a bearer of bad news." He then handed me a communication to read, which I found was an order relieving Hooker from the command and assigning me to it. His dearest, you know how reluctant we both have been to see me placed in this position. And as it appears to be God's will for some good purpose, at any rate, as a soldier, I had nothing to do but accept and exert my utmost abilities to command success. Captain Donaldson, when he heard that Meade was in command, and he was in Meade's corps, said, "This day General Meade was placed in command, an appointment most unlooked for by us all, and one not likely to inspire the greatest amount of confidence." Lieutenant Robertson was with the headquarters guard, the provost guard, and he says this morning Hooker was relieved from command, a General Meade appointed to fill his place. But Alpheus Williams, commander of the 12th Corps, or a division commander in the 12th Corps, was relieved. For myself, I'm rejoiced at the change of commanders. Now with a gentleman and a soldier in command, I have renewed confidence that we shall at least do enough to preserve our honor and the safety of the Republic. They would do that. They would have their redemption. They would have their moment at Gettysburg. And as Henry Abbott would say, by Jove, it was worth all our defeats after they had beaten back Pickett's charge. David Bream would say the Army of the Potomac has again met the enemy, and after 3 days of desperate fighting, have achieved the most glorious victory of the war. After all they'd been through, Gettysburg may not have been the turning point of the Civil War, as is often depicted, and we'll see it certainly wasn't with this army. But it was a crucial moment for this army. It was a crucial moment for this nation. This was an army that was a fragile instrument at that point. They needed to win this battle. And ultimately they prevailed, and it gave them renewed confidence to carry on. They were going to need it because the war was going to go on and the grumbling was going to continue. As Charles Fairchild would say, as the Army left Gettysburg, the soldiers and officers are loud in their praise of Meade. But Sergeant Charles Bowen would write, great dissatisfaction exists among the troops at the escape of Lee. But the Army has got so used to bungles that it almost seems a matter of course. There was a new manpower crunch. You can see the casualties we've taken at Chancellorsville, the people who've mustered out in May. Now Gettysburg, 67,000 troops have mustered out or been casualties between January and July. And then in September, the 11th and 12th Corps are transferred to Tennessee. The Army needs manpower. And they're going to get them from a new form of volunteers, whom the Army will refer to as conscripts, even though most of them aren't conscripts. Most of the men coming to the Army in the late summer of '63 and the fall are bounty men. They take bounties to volunteer. There's a few men who are conscripted, actually not very many, and some who will go as substitutes. Someone will pay them money to take their place when they got drafted. The Army is not high on these men. Conscripts are beginning to come to this Army, and a sorry-looking set they are. Many are substitutes who have received large sums of money, and who are old soldiers discharged or deserted, and who have come with the deliberate intention of deserting and again speculating in the substitute money. They are closely guarded. What a contrast between such hounds and the enthusiastic and eager volunteers of 1861. Our men thoroughly despise these cattle. Austin Stearns wrote, how well I remember that morning of getting up and going with Warner out to the vacant space between our tents and headquarters to see the subs who had come in the night, and how sadly we went back after looking at them. For all of the worst specimens of humanity, here they were. I don't know as there were any outright murderers. Still, there were those who had been engaged in riots in New York and had hung Negroes to lampposts. But all other classes of villains were represented, picked up from the slums of the cities. There were hundreds of them when they started from Boston to join us, but about a dozen had been shot or drowned on the voyage out and trying to escape. There were less than 100 men in our regiment, and the prospect of having this crowd turned loose upon us was not pleasing. They were divided into clans or cliques, and they would steal, fight, and do almost everything to each other clan. So this was the state of the Army as they're getting these thousands of conscripts. The scene that you see depicted here, which I won't spend the time to read the account from Captain Donaldson, is a execution. Because one of the ways General Meade began to gain control of these conscripts and their desertion, which was epidemic, is he began shooting them. And that began to curb some of the desertions. Also, the veterans began to be able to instill some discipline in these conscripts. But oftentimes these soldiers literally were afraid of the conscripts who had arrived, that they would steal from them, they would beat them, they might murder them, to do anything to get out of the Army. By November 20th, the Army had 83,000 men present for duty. You look at the little asterisk at the bottom, that's over 50,000 men less than what they had at the beginning of the Chancellorsville campaign. We also had a problem with the veterans. As we go into 1864, most of our veterans, their enlistment's going to expire in the summer of 1864 in the fall. 21,000 enlistments are due to expire by September 1st, 1864. The backbone of the Army could end up leaving the Army during the summer campaign. The incentive to the men was if 3/4 of the men of a regiment re-enlisted, the regiment could go home on a 30-day furlough, the regiment would maintain its organization, regimental number and flag, and they would also receive a $700 bounty. Well, the veterans were skeptical. General Meade has sent orders to this brigade to report at once how many men will re-enlist as veterans. I called the regiment together and spoke to them for half an hour, explaining fully, as fairly as I could, the inducements offered by the government to re-enlist as veterans, the prospects of the continuation of the war, and the special advantage of reorganizing as the 6th Regiment. I submitted an agreement for as many as close to sign, pledging themselves to re-enlist in the 6th Wisconsin as a veteran volunteer organization. Something over 80 men signed the agreement, but my impression is that the requisite 3/4 will not sign. Charles Davis would tell us that when they talked to his regiment, the 13th Massachusetts, pretty much nobody signed. They'd done enough, they felt. It was time for somebody else to step up and do the job. But ultimately, these veterans would reflect the determination of this Army to see this conflict through. They had suffered immeasurably. They'd survived all these battles, and they knew more were coming. The odds that they were going to survive the ones coming were not high. But as Captain J.G.B. Adams of the 19th Massachusetts recalled, Ben Falls, one of the men in his regiment, walked up and said, Ben Falls said, well, if new men won't finish the job, old men must. And as long as Uncle Sam wants a man, here's Ben Falls. By the end of March 1864, Meade would report that 26,767 veterans had re-enlisted. As the year ended, the Army numbered 81,700 men. There were more changes to come. Ulysses S. Grant would be coming east. The Army was going to undergo a major reorganization. This was 73,000 men less, like 40% less than what it had been a year before. Yet they had persevered. They had made it through this year. The despair, the defeat, the redemption, and now the determination. In the 6th Wisconsin, on December 31st, Rufus Dawes will record, remember, he said that he didn't think the regiment would re-enlist. It proved he was wrong. Our detached men, who have been cooks for officers, hostlers, clerks, and teamsters, of whom there are 68, nearly all declined to re-enlist. But the men who have stood by the old flag through fair and foul weather and through many bloody battles, almost to a man, dedicate their lives and service anew to their country. These men who have stood day after day in the presence of death, who have endured every sort of privation and suffering, present an example that should bring a blush of shame to the brows of the young men who have failed their country in this crisis. Thank you. Okay. We have time for a few questions here.
How you doing, Scott?
Good.
Thanks for that lecture, especially giving, it's good to give Hooker a little bit of credit for the reorganization, I think.
Yeah.
My question is about the cavalry engagement over here to the east.
Mm-hmm.
Even, if you looked at Jeb Stuart, even if everything went very well for him and he just brushed aside the Union cavalry, what could he have really done to affect the outcome of the Battle of Gettysburg? I mean, just spending more time over there, I'm more of a infantry person trying to understand
Right.
that, but now I'm trying to focus on cavalry. But I just, we're getting into speculation a little bit, but I just don't know what his intentions were. I don't understand how he could have changed the outcome of the battle.
Okay. So the question is, if you're not familiar with, on the third day of the Battle of Gettysburg, Lee sent the main force of his cavalry, almost all of his cavalry, east of Gettysburg. He met General David Gregg's cavalry in a cavalry engagement, and it was a drawn battle. Neither side was a clear-cut victor, but Stuart had to withdraw after the fight was over. He wasn't able to accomplish anything. So Stuart's movement appears to be the question is, what could he have accomplished if he was able to get through the Union cavalry? Well, it's important to consider, what was he trying to do? So for many, many decades, the speculation has been, and actually there is, I can find no evidence to support this, that Stuart's role was to attack the rear of the Union Army. Now, that was not the way Robert E. Lee ever used his cavalry. He did not use his cavalry as shock troops. They were far too valuable. It was very difficult to replace a cavalryman. In the Confederate service, if your horse was killed or disabled, the government didn't supply you with a horse. You had to get another one, which meant you had to go home. So there are often times during the Confederate service that half of a cavalry regiment would be absent because the men were home trying to get horses to come back. So to risk his cavalry in an attack against infantry and artillery against the Union rear is inconceivable by Robert E. Lee, and there's no evidence to support it. However, if you begin to consider that Stuart's role was what cavalry was designed to do, a pursuit force, and also a force to threaten communications, Stuart's position and the force that Lee committed to this make a great deal more sense. Lee was confident he was going to win the battle. The Army of the Potomac was going to retreat. When they retreated, where were they going? Down the Baltimore Turnpike and the Taneytown Road. What is the most effective force that you can use to pursue the enemy? Not your infantry, it's cavalry. They've got the mobility. Placing them out there where they have a direct route to the Baltimore Pike makes perfect sense. It gave Stuart the opportunity to be that pursuit force, because what Lee is seeking is a decisive blow to this army. He doesn't want them to get away. Cavalry will slow up their retreat, and Lee can send his infantry and artillery to destroy the rest of the Union Army. Also, if Stuart can get onto the Union rear as they start to retreat and disrupt their communications, he can also give Lee an advantage in trying to destroy the army. So ultimately, what I would say is what happened to Stuart is when Gregg's cavalry checked him, Stuart was unable to create any mischief in the Union rear. He couldn't disrupt Union communications. He certainly could not have even been a pursuit force because of the role that Gregg and Custer played. Okay? Yes, sir.
Scott, do you feel that Meade was unfairly criticized by Lincoln after winning this very, very bloody war, the bloodiest battle of the Civil War, for not chasing Robert E. Lee and the Army of the Northern Virginia?
Yeah, like I always tell people, Meade, I'll repeat it, Meade did pursue the Confederate Army. I can't tell you how many people I talked to are like, hey, the Union Army didn't pursue him. Like, really? What army was that caught up to Lee around Hagerstown? Williamsport. I'm pretty sure that was the Army of the Potomac, wasn't it? So, yes, he did pursue. But there's a few things you have to consider about Meade. And I'll answer your question directly. I understand Lincoln's frustration completely. I do think it was unfair. Lincoln did not know the circumstances at the front. However, at the end of the battle, when the Confederate Army begins to retreat, if you were in General Meade's shoes, we all know the Confederates were retreating, right? Did Meade know that? Did he know they were retreating? Not necessarily. What if the Confederates were falling back to South Mountain to take up defensive positions? Which way are you going to send your men, and where are you going to order your logisticians to send ammunition resupply and food? Frederick, Maryland, or Gettysburg, Pennsylvania? The difference is enormous. It's going to have a big impact on the center of gravity of your army. So initially, Meade ordered a reconnaissance by the Sixth Corps to try to determine what the Confederates were doing. That reconnaissance was very cautiously conducted by General John Sedgwick, probably too cautiously conducted. But that reconnaissance confirmed for Meade, plus his cavalry, which Meade sent in pursuit of the Confederates immediately. That reconnaissance confirmed for Meade that the Confederates were retreating, not falling back to another defensive position. That meant he had to have his logisticians transfer supplies to Frederick. He had to march his infantry to Frederick to resupply with ammo and with food. So the infantry has to go to Frederick, then they can cross the mountains to try to re-engage Lee. What you hope if you're Meade is that your cavalry will keep Lee at bay. They'll slow him up. And they did a pretty good job of it, even though Jeb Stuart's cavalry did a brilliant job of protecting the rear of the Confederate Army and its flanks. So ultimately, when Meade does catch up with the Confederate Army, Lee has entrenched his position. And on the morning of the 13th, when Meade had ordered an attack against the Confederate position, and his most experienced corps commanders that he had confidence in came to him and said, this attack has no hope of success, I think it was a moment of tremendous courage for Meade to call off that attack. We saw what Lee did at the Battle of Antietam. He was not entrenched. His army was at the end of its tether logistically. He fought the battle with about 40,000 men. The Federal Army had almost double the number. Imagine what Lee could have done at Williamsport in an entrenched position with his flanks anchored on the river. And the Army of the Potomac, which had lost 23,000 men in this battle, two of its best corps commanders, coming up to attack him. I don't like the odds. I think Meade made the right call. I fully understand Lincoln's frustration because the prospect that the war was going to go on. I often tell visitors, you know, one of the great ironies of this campaign is that everybody was unhappy with it when it was over. Think about it. Meade offered to resign, and so did Lee. Think about another campaign that both commanders offered to resign. Pretty remarkable. One more question.
Did the quelling of the draft riots in New York City have any effect on morale of the Army of the Potomac? Did they talk about it at all?
Did the quelling of the draft riots have any impact on the morale of the Army? It certainly had a great boost to the morale of the soldiers who were sent there to help quell them. They really had no tolerance for the people who were involved in the rioting. You know, one of the great ironies, if you read James McPherson's Battle Cry of Freedom, is that almost none of the people from the congressional districts where the rioting was the heaviest were ever drafted into the Army. Because most of the Irish who lived in that area, who were the primary people that got whipped up by the politicians to go out and start rioting, belonged to different societies and orders that they all pitched in money to. So if your number came up in the draft, they would either hire you a substitute or they would pay your commutation fee. And from what McPherson could determine, almost none of them ever got drafted. So it's one of the ironies that the people who do all this rioting, we imagine all got drafted and went into the Army, which isn't true. Anyway, thanks, folks. I'll be in there, I think, signing some books. Thanks for coming.